This is Power Athlete Radio. With your hosts, Denny K, Professor Booty, and the Luke Summers. And now, toes forward, hips locked, shoulders set, and retract those scapulars. It's time for some knowledge bombs.
Thanks for tuning into Power Athlete Radio. This week's episode is quite literally mind-blowing. As per usual, the Power Athlete crew brings you the latest research from experts in the field in order to empower your performance. Dr. David Perlmutter joins us to talk about the relationship between brain function and nutrition. He's the author of several books, including Grain Brain and Brain Maker, which help us, the average Jamoke, understand the correlation between food and the brain. Curious as to how gluten affects the hamster on a wheel that is your mind? Dr. Perlmutter unravels the mystery linkage between mouth, gut, and dome. Also, everyone wants to know what, when, and how much to consume to keep performance at optimal levels. Hear about the thousands of years of practice that humans have had in identifying tasty foods. What was once a survival mechanism to choose nutrient-dense fruits has now turned into an ever-available and insatiable appetite for the almighty sugar, quite arguably one of the biggest human health downfalls of the modern age. One thing is certain, Dr. Perlmutter will be providing more than enough food for thought to chew on. You like that? This is episode 139.
Yo, Power Athlete Nation, welcome to the premier podcast in strength and conditioning, Power Athlete Radio. This is Denny. Joining me today is John, Luke, and Tex, and our guest is Dr. David Perlmutter. Dr. Perlmutter serves as the Associate Professor at the University of Miami School of Medicine. He's a board-certified neurologist and fellow of the American College of Nutrition. He's brought to the public an awareness and understanding that challenging brain problems, including things like Alzheimer's and dementia and depression, may be prevented with the lifestyle changes, including like a gluten-free, low-carb, high-fat diet. And lately we've been pushing out a bunch of crucial information on like the ketogenic diet. And we're excited to have him on. So, Dr. Perlmutter, thank you for taking the time to talk some shop with us.
Well, great. I'm always happy to talk shop.
Yeah, Doc, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to get in and talk to us, and more importantly, talk to the greater listening audience. Let's dive right in. Can you give us a little bit of your CV? I know Denny did it a little bit, but what I'm more interested in is some of the books and really what you're doing presently in your research.
I'd be delighted. So I've kind of taken neurology in a different direction. As a neurologist earlier on in my career, I became really fairly frustrated with what we did as brain specialists. We really pretty much treated symptoms and never paid any attention to the disease, and certainly not to what was causing the disease. You know, we would give pain medication for headaches and treat maybe the tremor and the stiffness of Parkinson's, but when it came to stroke and head trauma and degenerative conditions like Alzheimer's, we had, and indeed mainstream neurology still has, nothing to offer to patients. So it became very clear a couple of decades ago that, in fact, lifestyle issues were hugely related to the brain, and most importantly, nutrition, but exercise as well, stress, sleep, etc. And I really dedicated myself at that point to learning as much as I could about these issues, these factors over which we have control. And that's really a big part of what this is all about, that we can learn about things and then leverage the knowledge to create a better brain that's more resistant to disease, more resistant to having issues once there's been trauma, etc. And I began studying, I began lecturing, I began writing, and over the years I've published 7 books. Most recently, a book called Grain Brain, which is now in 27 countries, and even more recently a book called Brain Maker, that not only focuses on the role of nutrition in the brain, but even more importantly, looks at how our nutritional choices affect the bacteria that live within us, most importantly in the gut, and how they, the bacteria, regulate so many important processes that relate back to the brain. The focus of Grain Brain was low carb, low sugar, avoidance of gluten, and welcoming fat back to the table. And I think it's really kind of an amazing set of circumstances that allow all of us today to be doing this podcast on the very day that the U.S. government has launched its 8th version of the dietary guidelines for Americans. It happened this morning. And what is so incredible about these new guidelines is they're saying we should eat eggs, that dietary cholesterol is not relevant anymore to our health, and that fat needs to be welcomed back to the table. And it happened this morning. That's the United States Government Dietary Advisory Committee. So,
victory.
Doc, I feel like we've been beating this war drum for the last 7 years, talking about you can't equal the fat on your waist to the fat that you're eating, and it's pretty amazing. I mean, talk about the pushback, but I think we're also just the fact that they're coming up to par with 60 years of research. I mean,
well, yeah, and it's not, with all due respect, it's not just 60 years of research, but a high-fat, ketogenic, low-carb diet has allowed us to survive for the last 2 million years. So it's a pretty robust experiment that's gone on that has cultivated our genome, that has cultivated the right DNA to respond to that specific type of diet. Now suddenly, in the last blink of an eye, we're challenging our physiology with high levels of sugar and carbohydrates, with much less fat and much less fiber. And, then we wonder why we're seeing such an explosion of things like obesity and diabetes, autoimmune conditions, and cancer. For those of us who are following the historical record and looking at, the most well-respected research being published today, the explosion of degenerative conditions is no surprise whatsoever, and in fact, it was predicted.
No, that's it's one of those things where, and people listening to this podcast are kind of on the front lines a little bit, in that they own gyms and they're, constantly in a situation where they're dealing with people that are coming in. And I know I used to, for 5-6 years, I owned a commercial gym after I retired from the NFL, and coming in and talking to people, or even, traveling out and lecturing and, traveling the world teaching, how uneducated people are really about diet. And you start talking about, ketosis or ketones, or you talk about, elevated fat, high carbohydrate, diets and the dangers of it. And it's almost as if you're, insulting their parents or insulting somebody, or talking about religion. And it's amazing to think that for the most part, people believe that the U.S. government, who's prescribing a lot of these things, would never make a mistake, and all this stuff's research based, and that people like us and people like yourself are quacks, and how dare you, and there's some personal agenda that you're pushing forward by making these recommendations. And I'm sure, Doc, you get the having your books and just seeing some of the backlash that you've received. It's pretty it's amazing when people are coming at you that vehemently.
I have to say that if they weren't coming and challenging me, then I'm not working hard enough, because if you're just parroting the status quo, there won't be any progress. If we're all singing the same song, there won't be any harmony. So we've got to push it a little bit, and that's how you move the ball down the field. That's how you make progress, is by doing things that are a little bit different. That's how we move ahead. And that's been sort of my method over the years, is really trying to connect the dots and then leveraging that information in terms of giving the public that information. And again, when these dietary guidelines were announced this morning, it's sort of, you just take a step back and say, yeah, you got it. I mean, we only started talking about that 2 decades ago, and how nice that the dietary guidelines are now being announced, but that's okay. I mean, sure, there's pushback, but people tend to be down on what they're not up on. And I would say that that's our mission, is to bring people up to speed, and results really speak volume in terms of people wanting to get their arms around staying with the program. I generally say to people, give me 2 weeks. Do what I'm asking you to do for a couple of weeks. We'll get back together at that point. Let's see how you're doing. And suddenly people are sleeping better, their mental clarity returns, their energy returns, their muscle aches are better, and they're cognitively improved even after a couple of weeks. That's a strong level of encouragement for them to stay on whatever it is you recommend.
I've actually read Grain Brain long before we reached out to you, and I know your guy was going to send us over a copy, but having already gone through it, can you talk a little bit about the mechanism for gluten in terms of deteriorating the brain? I mean, almost similar to like a leaky gut effect.
It is directly related to exactly that mechanism. So, we've seen the medical literature over the years by researchers in England who've talked about the relationship of gluten sensitivity to the brain. There's been this Dr. Marios Hadjivassiliou has written extensively in the journal Lancet, which is very well respected, indicating that you don't have to have celiac disease to have issues with gluten. Oh, really? I mean, to this day, there's still people writing disparaging blogs about me saying, if you don't have gluten, you should have all of if you don't have celiac, eat all the gluten you want, no big deal. Not recognize what's being published in the medical literature telling us that there is an entity called non-celiac gluten sensitivity. These are not people with an autoimmune condition. The relationship between gluten and the leaky gut that you so eloquently just described, I think was originally popularized by work done by a Harvard medical doctor, I'll think of his name in just a moment, Alessio Fasano. And what Dr. Fasano demonstrated is that gluten, and specifically the gliadin part of gluten, another protein found within gluten, induces this leakiness of the gut. When the gut leaks, then it induces inflammation. The reason that is important is because inflammation is the operative cornerstone of Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, autism, diabetes, autoimmune conditions, and even cancer. So, here we are having a conversation right now, a former NFL player and a neurologist, and we're talking about the gut and the leakiness of the gut being related to, keeping us healthy and functional. It's certainly a place where, 10 years ago, I don't think either of us would have thought this is where we'd be today.
No, Doc, when we talked a little bit offline in 1999 when I first was introduced to Mauro De Pasquale and got on an anabolic diet. He did a lot of my stuff. The changes in not only performance, just in terms of muscle structure and strength and clarity and a lot of these other things were very, very apparent to me early on. And then when a year later, I went and I worked with Tom Incledon out in Arizona, and we did pretty extensive blood work and allergy food testing. And I remember when he gave me the sheet, there was all these foods in red, and then there was some in orange, and there was in green. And I'm looking at this, and he goes, these are food allergies, and I'm like, so what are these are the ones I'm most allergic to. These are the ones I'm kind of allergic to, and the green are the good. And he goes, yeah, easy enough. I'm like, so I just need to eat all the green foods? He goes, yeah. And I was like, all right, seems easy enough. And it just so happened that all the red foods were soy, gluten, corn, and it kind of went through all these different ones. And then there were some moderate ones, and it was amazing within just eating the green foods, which looked like meat, fish, poultry, greens, sweet potatoes. I mean, it was basically what a lot of people today would call almost a paleo-esque diet. And white rice was on that green as well, and all of a sudden I started eating that, and I think in a matter of probably about 3 or 4 weeks, I dropped, easily 3-4% body fat, and all of a sudden became very similar to what I am today, and just performance went up. I was stronger, I was fitter, sleep better, and everything kind of really fell into line. And I remember I came back and I started talking to people, and they were like, so wait a minute, you were just eating different foods? I'm like, yeah, I just didn't eat the foods that were red.
You mean to tell me that you're making a statement here that food matters in terms of health? Wow, it's pretty bold.
Well, I mean, and what was so hard for me in a lot of ways is I'm like, food is by far the most anabolic substance in terms of performance that you could put into your body, and on top of it, it's probably one of the most emotionally crippling deals. And I'm sure you've dealt with people like I have who were so emotionally tied to food that every event that they go to, whether it be Christmas, holidays, birthdays, everything has to be tied around food. And what was pretty apparent early on as a NFL player, we didn't do anything that didn't involve food. We went out, we had wings, and guys were just massive eaters. You have really big guys that are are there for a reason. but food became kind of the focal point, and just the eating habits were pretty horrendous, and it was, pretty apparent to see, hey, if you eat this way, you're going to look a certain way. And I remember, just merely just eating those green foods, and it's, very similar to what the diet we recommend today is, which, I'm sure you'd fall right in line with. And, performance went up, everything. And then, all of a sudden we get to the end of this deal, and, and part of the reason we're talking is that concussion movie came out, and, about it, the NFL hiding a lot of the, cognitive brain issues that are obviously very apparent. But there was kind of a bigger thing where I realized a lot of the recommendations that they're making, whether it be, dietary through the teams, or, the pushing a Gatorade, or even the standardized westernized diet, I think is really increasing and aiding and almost exacerbating a lot of these conditions and making them worse.
Well, I would agree with you. I think that we can talk science, which I'm delighted to do, but let's for just a moment talk about history. And again, the type of diet that has allowed you and me to have this conversation today, allowed our parents to meet, allowed our grandparents to meet, and goes back thousands and thousands of generations, has been a diet that is basically deriving most of its calories from fat, some calories from protein, and very, very little calories from carbohydrates, because our hunter-gatherer forebears didn't have access to carbohydrates, except on occasion at a certain time of the year when fruit tends to ripen or the berries are ripe. And that's generally in the late summer or early fall. That's when fruit is available. And, you wouldn't suddenly stumble upon a grove of trees with cartons of orange juice hanging from the limbs. There would be the occasional berry, the occasional fruit. And, that allowed us to survive. That was a time when our sweet tooth, which we've had for a couple millions of years, has actually served us well, because we loved sweet back then. And sweet was an indication not just that in the fruit the starch had been broken down to sugar, which made it sweet, but in addition that fruit had the highest level of antioxidant vitamins, of polyphenols, of fiber, etc. So it was really, for us, the very best time to eat the fruit. And frankly, it was the very best time for the fruit to be eaten, because that's when the seeds were just getting ready to germinate. So we helped out the fruit plant, and it helped out us. But the real key there is that this is a time when there's maximum sugar, late summer, early fall, and our bodies were stimulated by our sweet tooth by eating sugar, which caused us to have higher levels of insulin, which allowed our bodies to make fat, which is really the primary reason that we have insulin. It's not sugar storage, it's to make fat. And that allowed us as hunter-gatherers to survive the winter when food was less available. So this mechanism of eating sugar and making fat was an incredibly powerful survival mechanism that has allowed us to survive to this moment. But that said, that same mechanism is happening 365 days a year, multiple times each day, in people that are alive today. And unfortunately, that mechanism of sugar leading to increased insulin, which leads to fat deposition, is the reason that our health is so compromised. So, you think back, wonderful, it allowed us to get here, but now we've got the ability to understand that, and using the parts of the brain that define us as humans, the forebrain, allow us to override our desire to always satisfy sweet, which is as powerful as reproduction. That's where liking sweet is in the primitive part of the brain that has to do with fight or flight, reproduction. That's how strong this desire to eat sweet is. What's happened is that monetary interests have gotten involved over the past 30 years to really convince us that carbs are good for us, especially this notion of complex carbohydrates, which is really far-fetched, immediately broken down to simple sugars when you digest them. And at the same time, there's this notion that fat is suddenly, after 2 million years, suddenly bad because our scientists told us so. And that, I think, is hugely responsible for our ill health. You only have to go back to March of 2007 in the Journal of the American Medical Association when there was published a head-to-head comparison of the Atkins diet, which is a very low carbohydrate, higher fat diet, with the Ornish diet, which is just the opposite. Very high levels of carbs, extremely low levels of dietary fat, and they looked at what was the outcome over a 12-month period in a group of over, I think, 300 individuals who were overweight or even obese, and what they found was really quite compelling, that there was dramatically more weight loss in the individuals on the Atkins diet, and there was great improvement in all kinds of other parameters that you would look at in the blood, like cholesterol measurements, even blood pressure, again, in the Atkins diet, eating more fat. And yet, when this study was published, no one wanted to talk about it. And we clung to this notion of fats being bad and carbs being good. And finally, again, I'm going to say it for the third time, this morning, the dietary guidelines are published saying, hey, guess what? The carbs are killing you, and welcome fat back to the table.
Doc, could you talk about the evolution in terms of how we're able to accomplish that in 30 years? And I know that gluten-free and a lot of these diets are shifting that way. So is it the money now, like you said, a monetary example that the government is passing this?
I would never say that there's complete altruism in the publication and the issuing of the dietary guidelines from the government. There's always lobby influence. Lobby influence is how we got to the original recommendations of complex carbs. It came from the grain industry. It came from them lobbying the Food and Drug Administration, and that's how that all happened. I mean, I'm not saying something that people aren't certainly well aware of. So there's still going to be influence of industry in governmental decision and policy. But that said, that's the time for us to step up and be recognized in terms of offering up the other side of the story. Then the public has this information. They can make the decision based upon being better educated. A few months ago, I wrote a blog about the flu vaccine. And, everybody's saying you have to have your flu immunization. If you don't have a flu vaccine every year, probably your children will be born naked and terrible things are going to happen in the world. We don't know, but you've got to get it. I mean, you can walk down the concourse in an airport these days, and they can give you a flu shot. So all I published was simply the notion that you should know what the CDC is telling us in terms of the effectiveness of flu vaccines. And when you go to the drugstore and they're offering you a flu shot, they'll say, oh yeah, this is going to be 90% effective in keeping you from getting the flu. Well, with all due respect, that's not what the CDC has told us. In the year 2014-15, the effectiveness of the flu shot in reducing your risk of getting the flu was 23%. Means 77% of people would still get the flu. So it's my mission, and I think all of our mission is to just, hey, opinion is great, but let's look at what the science is telling us. The science in terms of ketosis and a higher fat diet, in terms of protecting the brain, has been around a long time. The science with respect to eating more complex carbs and cutting fat is shaky at best, as we're now recognizing. And I think, let's be fair, let's vet this science in a very educated and comprehensive way.
Doc, you're going to laugh at this, but my first impression, and more importantly, my first experience with the flu shot was when I was playing in Philadelphia. They required everybody on the team to get a flu shot. And so I, lined up like everybody and get a flu shot. And it's really been the only time in the last 20 years I've been sick. I got so ill, I almost didn't play on a Sunday. And from that point on, I would never take the flu shot again. And they're like, you need a flu shot. I'm like, dude, you can find me. I'm not letting you ever do it. And never got sick again. And but I used to, every year would watch guys get the flu shot and then end up getting sick. And it just became one of those things where I'm like, this seems, just anecdotally, just watching, just being like, no, I'm not doing that. But these are things that people buy into kind of wholeheartedly, where it's like, oh, everybody gets a flu shot. The flu shot must prevent me. And it goes back to that idea of, people just don't want to know, or they don't want to ask, or they're just not conscientious enough to really object to everything around them.
You're exactly right. You say anecdotally, and I would say that the plural of anecdote is data. The more these anecdotes that accumulate, it suddenly becomes something you can publish. And hey, we have a huge herd mentality in America that is prompted by the commercials on the evening news. Everybody thinks that if they have an upset stomach when they eat a bratwurst, that they should continue eating the bratwurst but take some kind of acid-blocking drug. No, your body's telling you something, and you've got to pay attention. Don't just take the drug and push through it. That doesn't make any sense at all.
Well, we've always said if you eat something and all of a sudden you go and get violently sick where you're in the bathroom and your body exits it, then that's a good indication that you shouldn't eat that food.
Well, don't you need to test that at least a dozen or two dozen times?
So I had one client who we sent out and got blood work, and he had probably one of the highest levels of inflammation I've ever seen. To the point where I was like, dude, you're, like his blood work was a disaster, and we ended up, kind of going through and getting food allergies, and he's like, I don't eat any of these foods, I don't eat any of these foods. And it ended up coming out that he's like, once a week I go out and I go eat nachos, and we go out to this Mexican food restaurant with the family and I eat all this Mexican food. And the guy had this death allergy. Probably the most severe allergy I've ever seen to corn. And he's like, as soon as I eat, I got to run to the bathroom. And he goes, it just basically expels me. And they have to bring in a hazmat around the bathroom. And he's like, but it's only once a week. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. If you got that violently ill off of eating one meal, why did you eat it? He's like, well, I didn't think it was really that big a deal. Everybody gets sick when they eat, right? And
right.
But that's the one that just, or, I have a pitcher that we've been working with for the last year who, pitches at a small college, and he's got a bunch of talent, throws a 94, 95 mile an hour fastball. And he came in, he was having, some body fat, and he was some performance issues and a couple things. And we ended up putting him on, a fairly strict ketogenic diet because both of his parents have, diabetic issues, and he just has a history for it. So we did a little bit of carb cycling and kind of put it back in as a refeed if he needed it with, just obviously getting him to go, kind of avoiding kind of standard westernized type stuff. And he goes back to school, and he lost 20 pounds. He picked up muscle. He got stronger. He's performing at his best, and he starts talking to a strength coach about diet. Next thing you know, he lands up in the health administration office where the doctors are lecturing him on how dangerous it is that he's not consuming carbohydrates. So he calls me.
Again, people are down on what they're not up on. And, again, what did the Dietary Advisory Committee say? And what have humans been eating for 2 million years? So when we see this big push for the paleo movement, with people like Rob Wolf, Lauren Cordain, Nora Gedgaudas, and, they're pretty much in the mainstream looked upon as outliers. I think that the tide is shifting, however, and I think the results are propelling this. The results that people get, they publish on my blog site on Facebook, I went low carb and higher fat, and I'm losing weight. It seems crazy, but it's happening. And it's just, again, I say, give me a couple of weeks, just do it, as crazy as it sounds. Talk about crazy. I'm treating certain medical disorders with fecal transplantation, giving people good fecal material from a healthy person who've upset their gut bacteria and reversing various medical situations. You talk about crazy. Who would have ever thought about that? And now over 500 hospitals in America are using this technique, fecal transplantation, to treat a certain type of diarrheal illness called Clostridium. So nothing is off the table, and especially with me, with patients that I deal with who have really serious issues, the Alzheimer's patients, the autism patients, and their caregivers and families. There's no pharmaceutical for them, and so we've really got to push the envelope.
Doc, you had said something earlier about just how it's the ketogenic diet is a little bit similar to the Paleolithic diet, and I know we've had some guests on who's kind of dispelled this myth that if you ate a Paleolithic diet that you would have the same benefits as our ancestors did millions of years ago, bigger bone, more muscle mass, better eyesight. And these guys have kind of said that, the environments are different, that today's environment is different than how it was back in the hunter-gatherer times.
Well, I think that's a very, very compelling statement, because there is some truth to that. And I think that our environment today is far more stressful on multiple levels than the hunter-gatherer times. I mean, sure, we're not going to get chased by a saber-toothed cat on the one hand, but on the other hand, our environment is toxic. We're exposed to heavy metals. We're exposed to endocrine disruptors. There are loud noises. There's stress. There's things on the television that raise your cortisol level. Every day you're hearing about some new violent issue. So in that regard, that's very stressful to the human body, and it is an environmental event, as is the food we eat. But I would say that the response to that is, therefore, we've got to increase the nutrient density of our food to increase our detoxification pathways. We've got to increase the foods that help us reduce the inflammation that's caused by our change in environment. Basically, we've got to amp up the paleo diet and really recognize that we can do so because we understand it. But I think when you look at the non-paleo approach that welcomes sugar and carbs to the table, that's adding insult to injury. That's compounding the changes that we experience in our environment today, and it's certainly something to be avoided.
I'm glad that it's not too late, because I know there's some information out there that it shows like when Neolithic type foods were brought into our diet, the body I know we're talking like brain, but like body composition started changing, like narrow jaws, the teeth weren't set right, beer bellies, like the humans started forming different, and it almost makes it sound like that now our genes have been altered and this is our future, but yet we can just kind of clean up the diet, take like a ketogenic approach, and we can still get those benefits. We could still have the benefits physically, even in that kind of a state, like a state of maybe 80 or 90% of society in like this Neolithic kind of like body composition state.
Denny, you're talking about.
You mentioned.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say, Denny, part of the thing you're looking at too is you talk about like gene expression over the amount of years. You talk about nutrient density over the course of generations and generations. You have to remember that epigenetics looks back at like what our grandparents, and then you look at the people today, 2 or 3 generations that have been eating this way, opposed from people that moved to this country that might not have eaten this way. So I mean, I don't necessarily know if in one generation one person can make. All of a sudden you go from, like you said, like the beer belly with the picture of the Egyptian who's in bad shape, and all of a sudden put him into like the modern hunt and gatherer idea, the guy running on the Serengeti. So I mean, the problem is that in real time, I don't know if these things can reverse themselves. But I think what the doc is really talking about is, can we avoid and stay off some of these problems that seem to be plaguing our society in mass numbers that didn't exist even 50 years ago.
Well, there are really 2 sides to that discussion, I think, that are worth looking at. And first is the idea of our genetic code being modified by our lifestyle choices. And that's a relatively new concept, that our food choices, our habits, what we expose ourselves to, changes moment to moment the expression of our genes. And it's been estimated that some 70% of genes that code for health and longevity are actually under our control. That's very compelling because back when I went to medical school, we thought that our DNA code was locked in a glass case and determined everything that we would do and be in our whole physiology. So, the notion of this fixed code, I think, has been replaced by this idea of a very dynamic DNA that changes and is adaptable to changes in the environment, which is really a good thing once you understand that, and once you understand how you can change expression of your DNA in a positive way. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. But the other really compelling news is that it looks as if our experiences in this lifetime do in fact change the DNA of our germ cells that we pass on to our progeny, to our children. And so therefore they inherit genes that are slightly different than ours that were in fact changed generation to generation. So we are undergoing generational changes. And it's actually very true, and that kind of rocked the boat when that information came out as well. But I think the empowering part of the story is that we have the ability to change our gene expression for the better. There's one gene pathway I just want to mention called the NRF2 pathway. It's getting a lot of attention these days, especially in the field of neurology, because it mediates inflammation, antioxidant function, and detoxification. And we can ramp it up by eating cruciferous vegetables like broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, kale, by drinking tea, and by aerobic exercise, and even by drinking coffee and taking turmeric, for example. So there are things that we can do to enhance the body's own production of antioxidants far beyond, taking the vitamin C and the vitamin E as a supplement. And this also reduces this pathway of inflammation, free radical mediated stress, and helps us detoxify this very, very toxic world that we're exposed to. So, these are simple dietary changes that have a profound effect on our physiology based upon changing the expression of our life code. That's pretty darn cool.
What kind of environmental issues do you find to be kind of most, I guess you could say, most damaging to people? Like, for example, we live here in Southern California and happen to live right near John Wayne Airport, and planes fly over. So, constantly involved in some form of, jet fuel, jet exhaust landing on us, opposed from somebody living in New Jersey near the dumps. I'm sure you see, within your own practice and other people, that there are certain environmental things that can be extremely, gripping and toxic and damaging to individuals.
I would say that's correct. And while there are differences comparing Southern California to areas of New Jersey or wherever you may want to go, there are some common threads across Western cultures that are, by virtue of their scope, probably the biggest issues. And I'd say you'd have to include antibiotics at the very top of the list. Here is a class of medications that have been life-saving and have a very positive upside. But antibiotics, because of their incredible overusage in Western cultures these days, are threatening the health of our gut bacteria, and that is having a devastating effect on human health. That science is just in its very nascent stages. We're just beginning to understand what we're doing to ourselves every time we take an antibiotic. And keep in mind that here in America, 70% of the antibiotics that are used are actually going into raising cattle and poultry. So so you can't escape it. The other thing that I think is so widespread that is an environmental issue are the genetically modified foods. Not necessarily because they in and of themselves are inherently threatening, but the main reason that they've genetically modified the corn and the soy, etc., is to make them Roundup resistant, make them resistant to a weed killer that they then spray on the crops. So when you're eating the tortilla that you mentioned earlier, or I think it was the nachos, and the guy got sick, the thought that comes to my mind is here is a food based on corn sprayed very heavily with this glyphosate, this Roundup, this herbicide, that now has been characterized as being a significant threat to human health because it changes our gut bacteria. It changes our microbiome. The gut bacteria harbor 99% of the DNA in your body. That's a compelling thought. When the World Health Organization in April of last year issued a statement saying that glyphosate, which is this weed killer in Roundup and 750 other products, that this glyphosate is a probable, not possible, human, not laboratory animal, carcinogen. That's what they stated worldwide. We have to take notice of that. This is being used to the extent of more than 100 million metric tons a year on our planet. It's killing the bugs in the soil, killing the bugs in the atmosphere, in the oceans, in lakes, and in our intestines as well. So these are two fairly underreported environmental threats that are turning out to be probably the biggest threats that we could consider.
Doc, I'd like to turn a little bit and start talking a little bit about concussions and some of the brain injury, as we talked a little bit offline, with the concussion movie coming out and all of a sudden the stuff with the NFL and them finally kind of acknowledging that repeated head injuries, could lead to CTE and other key factors. Is there, and I'm sure you have ideas and thoughts and definitely some interesting take on how this is happening and more importantly, is there a way to reverse it and maybe safeguard the guys against it?
Well, it's wonderful that it's coming to light. You know, we've seen the data for a long time. It's very compelling when you recognize who knew about this and when they knew about it and how it was suppressed and how that filtered down, not just at the level of professional sports, but how that suppression of this information ultimately impacted college level, high school level, and even middle school level sports. Had people known what was going on in professional, in the NFL, for example, others at the other levels would have taken notice a lot sooner, and we would have protected or done things differently for women's soccer or Pop Warner even. So it's a good thing that this is happening. We're understanding how darn delicate the brain really is, and how even a single event of trauma, but certainly worse with multiple events of seemingly small events of trauma, sets into motion a cascade of events that then continues on year after year and may actually even worsen year after year, even when people are super careful. So, hey, we've all been there. I've looked up from the mat in full contact martial arts at this and wondered where I was. I don't know how many times. And what can I do these days to rejuvenate my brain and to protect it with a positive family history of Alzheimer's? The good news is that we know there are some really powerful things that people can be doing preemptively, even before the event occurs, right after the event, and then really as a lifelong program to keep the brain healthy. And by and large, these are dietary recommendations. So let's just go through them. There is an omega-3 called DHA, docosahexaenoic acid. It's the reason people take fish oil or other sources of DHA like algae. And what we know DHA does is it's nature's anti-inflammatory. DHA blocks an enzyme called COX-2. It's a COX-2 inhibitor. That's how ibuprofen and aspirin and Celebrex work. They block the COX-2 enzyme. So that's one of the things that it does, but it also turns on genes. Again, we're talking epigenetics here. It turns on the genes that allow the brain to grow new brain cells, increase the connection between brain cells called neuroplasticity, and also allows the brain cells to be more protected if they are traumatized. So taking a fish oil pill is sort of like putting your helmet on 24/7. There is, in fact, one of the NFL teams that has been on fish oil for a number of years, and they've reported, my good friend Dr. Joseph Maroon, who's their team doctor and neurosurgeon, has been able to report significant reduction, not just in cognitive-related injuries, but in systemic problems, loss, not being able to play because of pain and pulled muscles, etc. So DHA, you can get it anywhere you like. You can eat salmon. I recommend a dosage somewhere in the neighborhood of around 1,200 milligrams a day. If you take a capsule that has 200 milligrams of DHA, that's 6 capsules a day. Good to keep it refrigerated. You can chew them, you can swallow them, but DHA is probably, along with a ketogenic diet, we'll get there in a moment, absolutely at the top of the list. Now, the next thing that we've been hinting around throughout our discussion has been this notion of a higher fat diet that's good for the brain. Who knew? I mean, again, this is in the face of 30 years of being told that fat is going to kill you, it's going to make you fat and give you diabetes. And we know nothing is further from the truth. Let's put that aside for now and talk about how wonderfully effective being in a low grade of ketosis is for the brain. First, let me define ketosis. Ketosis is the state in which your metabolism shifts away from burning sugar and carbs to burning fat. When you're low in carbs, when you're in starvation, for example, or you are inducing this state by eating low levels of carbs, then the liver changes body fat into fats that are called ketones, specifically one that's important for the brain called beta-hydroxybutyrate. That'll be on the quiz. You need to know that. And when the brain is burning these fats, the brain is burning a fuel that is super efficient, that codes for the gene that allows the brain to rebuild itself, that actually leads to the brain growing new brain cells. We call that neurogenesis, which 30 years ago, when I was in medical school, we were told that didn't happen in humans, that it's stem cell therapy in your brain. You get on a low-grade ketotic diet and you're doing stem cell therapy to rebuild your brain. That's a powerful argument. But it also allows the brain cells, and really every cell throughout your body, to burn fuel but create less exhaust, if you will. Exhaust in the form of damaging chemicals called free radicals that damage protein, damage fat, and even damage your DNA. And you can measure this. You can measure in the laboratory animal the damage to DNA before it's placed on a ketogenic diet and then after. And the rate of damaging free radicals, damaging the DNA, goes down dramatically. Gary Taubes wrote a wonderful book called Why We Get Fat and What to Do About It. And he is a really top-notch medical researcher. I've had the opportunity to interview him. And what he talks about is the fact that a low-grade ketosis is really the natural state of humans for the past 2 million years. And it's only suddenly that we're burning these carbs and not protecting our brains and not as aggressively allowing our brain cells to repair themselves and even to grow new connections between brain cells, which is fundamental for learning. So here's what you got to do. You got to take your DHA every day. You got to cut your carbs significantly. I recommend, for most adults, somewhere in the neighborhood of total carbs, 60 to 80 grams a day. And you've got to welcome fat back to the table. I like to recommend a couple of tablespoons of extra virgin coconut oil, a liter each week, a liter of extra virgin olive oil. It seems like a lot, but it isn't. Now, why would I say that? A wonderful study was published last year in the Journal of the American Medical Association that showed, in comparison to the Mediterranean diet, those individuals who maintained the Mediterranean diet but added in a liter of olive oil each week had a reduction in risk of dementia by 41%. Wow. So for a guy like me, that makes sense because my dad had Alzheimer's. But for everybody listening to this podcast, you need to understand that if you live to be age 85, your risk of getting Alzheimer's is 50-50. So you want to do everything you can to reduce your risk. The third thing that comes to us from the University of Pittsburgh is the idea that you can also turn on that gene that will protect your brain by getting simply some aerobic exercise. The study involved two groups of individuals. One group stretched for 2 years, and one group actually did an aerobics program, a whopping 142 minutes of aerobics each week. Do the math. That's 20 minutes a day. That's all I'm asking. Get your heart rate up for 20 minutes every day. That turns on the genes that will not only increase the chemical that grows new brain cells, but as they showed in the study, the brains of those people who exercise, their memory center, which is called the hippocampus, actually grew in elderly people in whom otherwise it would have shrunken over the 2-year period. Wow. So you can turn on stem cell therapy by taking some DHA, getting yourself in a low grade of ketosis, and 20 minutes of aerobics each day. That's all I'm asking.
Now, Doc, are those universal prescriptions, or is that based off of kind of lifestyle and activity level? For example, let's say the extreme. You have a obese individual, male, 300 plus pounds, and then you have a NFL football player. Those are going to be optimal recommendations for longevity, or is that because we often weigh recommendations for our clients based off of what is the priority here, performance or longevity, because those two are in some cases mutually exclusive on some of these recommendations.
Well, I think that they aren't, and with all due respect, if you take somebody who's morbidly obese and getting no exercise, certainly that person's going to have to ramp up to the 20 minutes. I mean, if this person can barely get out of a chair, you, John, are going to need to work with that person and work on them getting on a program that escalates day to day, a little bit more exercise. 60 to 80 grams of carbs a day is all that person needs. It's all an NFL player needs, with all due respect. And, the last part of the program, adding in the DHA, there's nobody that I can think of who wouldn't benefit from DHA. Now, the notion of being good for health is not mutually exclusive with the notion of longevity, because really there wouldn't be any difference. What's going to keep you healthy today is going to help keep you healthy in the long run. We're not living for today. Basically, we're really trying to get to our health and then maintain our health for the longest time we can.
Maybe I misspoke there, Doc. I meant performance. Being an optimal performer in your domain, whether you're an offensive lineman or a 100-meter sprinter or a mixed martial artist.
Yeah, and we're all going to have levels of glycogen that are going to get us through the 4 quarters. Do you have necessarily the degree of glycogen storage in your liver and muscles that allow you to run a marathon? Probably not, but you have to understand that you have 20-fold more calories stored in body fat than you have stored in glycogen. And all that needs to happen here is you have to shift your metabolism so that you are what is called keto adapted. What does it mean? And it takes several weeks to get there. But after you've kept yourself in a low grade of ketosis for several weeks, suddenly you're able to flex fuel. Your body's able to use both dietary fat as well as body fat as a fuel. And you're not going to run out of gas. The reason that you have to suck the gels when you're running long distance, a half marathon or greater, because usually if you're running 10-minute miles, you can burn glycogen and still make it through a half marathon without much of an issue. But after that, if you don't have a heck of a lot of glycogen stores, then you're going to need something. That's why people eat those gels that make you gag, and drink the Gatorade and the Powerade along the second half of that route. But if your body is saying to you, hey, this is cool, been here before, we're going to be tapping into body fat, we got plenty of that. I mean, when you look at the Kenyan long distance runners, they're not carb loading, and they win all the Boston marathons. These guys are not loading up with carbs. They're not pounding the pasta the night before the race. And even to this day, when you go to a race, they always have the spaghetti dinner the night before. That's the last thing in the world that you want to do, is to load up with a carb-rich, gluten-loaded, inflammation-inducing food that's going to spike your blood sugar the night before the race. Your body produces insulin, drives your blood sugar low, and you end up at the starting line not knowing which way's up. So if you don't eat the night before, your body's now getting ready. It's burning the fat, chewing the fat, if you will. And that situation is set. You've got a perfect delivery system of calories, low levels of inflammation. You're ready to go. Our ancestors didn't carb load before they chased down the gazelle. And we didn't chase down animals. We basically would follow animals at a trot until finally the animals would fall over because they couldn't keep up the distance. That's how we killed animals, with spears. It wasn't that we suddenly ambushed them. So I think we take a lesson again from our Paleolithic forebears.
Well, Doc, that's actually how our Neolithic, or our what is it? What is it?
Neolithic?
No, not the Neolithic. Oh, dude, I can't even think of it right now. But it's the Neanderthals died. So when they looked at all the Neanderthal skulls, they were all bashed. So the Neanderthals used to actually rush in and try to beat the animals to death, and then they end up all dying that way. So when they looked at the Neanderthals, every one of the skulls that they found all of these massive kind of crushes in them, whereas the Homo sapiens were a little bit smarter about like tracking and following. Slow play. But Doc, hey, can you get into like the keto adapted? I mean, that's pretty something that is, seems pretty easy to me, but can you talk a little bit about what it takes to get keto adapted? Because the biggest trick that we've seen with people is even though they cut the carbs low, they end up kind of eating a little too much protein, and like the protein neogenesis ends up kicking them out of ketosis, and it's kind of this interesting deal. I mean, we started using ketone meters and started checking ketones, and obviously you talked about earlier about using coconut oil, MCT, and also maybe ketone salts and ketone esters to try to stay in ketosis.
Well, I'd be delighted to. So again, keto adaptation is really training your body to burn fat and getting your body away from reliance upon basically glucose or carbohydrates that are broken down to glucose. And it takes some time. And the way that you make that happen is to restrict your carbs, restrict your sugars, and welcome back to the table sources of fat. And in this case, to get into ketosis, it would be the addition of coconut oil and or medium chain triglyceride oil, MCT oil, which is certainly, as you well know, very, very popular amongst bodybuilders to cut fat. Who knew? Eating fat to get thin. It's very popular in health food stores as well. There's a wonderful book, from my perspective, wonderful, called Alzheimer's Disease, What If There Was a Cure?, written by Dr. Mary Newport, who put her husband on a very powerful ketone-based diet, who had Alzheimer's, and his situation improved dramatically. So it's really critically important that carbohydrates are limited, and I think you make a very, very good point about the protein, because people, and we mentioned this earlier, and that is that the keto diet is not exactly the same as the paleo diet, because when you're wanting to get in ketosis, you cannot pound the protein, because as you well point out, you will create sugar through a process called gluconeogenesis out of the amino acids being reassembled and recycled into creating a sugar, basically, which will then make it more difficult for you to get into a low grade of ketosis. So when you are going through this process, you can be measuring your urine with various measuring sticks that they sell at the pharmacy. They have various names, but you can measure the level of ketosis that you're developing. And I want to get back to a question that you raised earlier about, is this a one-size-fits-all? Is this a universal kind of recommendation? And I think it's important that I caveat here, and that is that certainly this is not what diabetics need to be doing. So if any of you out there listening to this podcast have diabetes, you want to discuss any of these ideas with your treating physician. But again, the key to getting your blood sugar under control if you're a type 2 diabetic is, of course, to cut down on the carbohydrates. That's what's fueling your diabetes. That's what got you into this mess in the first place. So if you're on medication and you suddenly drop your sugars and drop your carbs, then your blood sugar can get dangerously low. So this is something you want to work on with your doctor, and hopefully she or he understands the benefits of what we're trying to achieve here. So, in a nutshell then, this is a process by which you basically tell your physiology that you're changing fuels here, that you're shifting from carbs and sugars to burning fat. You're ramping up the enzyme activity in your liver to begin the process of what's called beta oxidation of fat, and your body's going to be happy forevermore.
Doc, we've had several clients that are, ex-athletes, fighters, MMA, and, football players that have had some form of traumatic brain injury. And when we put them in ketogenic approaches and trying to get them into ketosis, the one comment that I've heard that's pretty universal is their insomnia becomes kind of the deal, that all of a sudden they sleep pretty well. As soon as they start trying to get into ketosis and we ramp that, or we cut the carbs back and ramp up the fats, instantly insomnia kind of results. And after just doing a little kind of poking around, I realized, or some of the literature I read talked about, these being, problems with the hypothalamus and, just really a indicator of something bigger. Have you seen that within your own practice, or have any?
Well, I've seen many things happen, and I think that there are a couple of other points that people need to take with a grain of salt. And the first point is take a grain of salt. A lot of people who become fatigued and a little anxious perhaps during the early stages of this and develop maybe headaches, is because they're not getting enough salt. And so we recommend about 1 to 2 teaspoons of salt each day. I think it goes a long way because, frankly, when you're shifting away from these processed carbohydrate-rich foods, these are foods that generally contain a lot of salt. When you're going into ketosis, you tend to urinate more and you tend to lose your salt. As such, you also should take a potassium and magnesium supplement, especially when you're cutting back on your protein. So potassium, magnesium, and sodium, I think, are really important from the ion perspective. What works from a supplement perspective would be a little bit of maybe 500 to 1,000 milligrams of tryptophan. Seems to work really well. And, a lot of people think as they're easing into ketosis that they don't want to exercise during that period of time. With all due respect, you need to continue your exercise at that point because that's what's going to push the shift. As your body says, hey, where are my calories coming from now that I need them because I'm exercising, it'll draw upon your fat. It'll tend to push that whole process forward.
Supplement like some psyllium husk or anything like a fiber. I mean, that's another comment we get from people. All of a sudden they get kind of backed up a little bit, and my comment was always just keep adding fat and everything will kind of clean out a little bit. But
it's a point. Let me just, if I may, just approach it for a moment. With all due respect, the fiber that you'd want to give somebody in this situation is psyllium, and the reason being is that what psyllium does is it leads to lowering of magnesium and lowering of other ions. It tends to bind them, and then people poop them out. So I think that would not be my first recommendation, and that's why we discuss things. Again, I think when you add back magnesium, especially in the form of magnesium citrate, my gosh, people are going to have no trouble pooping. But I would say that there's another discussion here with reference to fiber that I think is really, really at the top of the list, and that is people need to be consuming what's called prebiotic fiber. Fiber is great, but the unique type of fiber called prebiotic fiber is important because that's the special type of fiber that nurtures the gut bacteria. You know, you think your body is in for a shock when you suddenly get off the carbs and you're adding in the fat. What do you think your gut bacteria think about that? You know, they got used to this crappy diet, and now suddenly you've turned the tables on them. You've got to nurture your gut bacteria by having great levels of prebiotic fiber. Now, you can eat foods that are low in carbohydrate and have a lot of good prebiotic fiber. Jicama, Mexican yam, Jerusalem artichoke, dandelion greens, garlic, onions, leeks, etc. But, you know, these days there are some wonderful prebiotic fibers at the health food store that are made from things like baobab tree or acacia gum. And these are incredibly wonderful ways of giving your gut the fiber that it needs, but at the same time nurturing the gut bacteria.
Is this kind of where like cold potato starch, where people are using like cold rice and the resistant starch?
Exactly right.
Yeah,
not so much rice-based, but the potato starch is a very significant prebiotic, and it's certainly worthwhile. And in terms of bumping your carbs, you don't really see that happening with potato starch.
Yeah, I actually tried the potato starch, and the amount of gas that it was pretty funny. Like I felt like I was like on a game show or something. It was pretty interesting. But I definitely think that there's an opportunity, especially for that, to kind of come into play. But what about in terms of vegetables? I mean, is it something where people can free eat greens? Like we talked a little bit about cruciferous vegetables being extremely important for the antioxidant effect. So I mean, would it be something where you sit down, you obviously eat your fats, you eat like a moderate, lesser amount of protein, and then just kind of, getting up a ton of roughage and all that through cruciferous vegetables?
Yes, and the plate should be 70% nutrient-dense, colorful, organic vegetables. And so you're right. It is a more vegetarian diet, and when people are eating that, they're not going to have any trouble pooping, that's for sure. Let me just get back to the gas situation. And, I usually tell people that will pass. That's a joke. But
no, I got it. It was funny.
You're ultimately, upregulating the metabolism of the good bacteria that live within you. And it's always good with these prebiotics that you're adding into your diet to increase them slowly, over a period of several weeks. You don't want to go and get a prebiotic fiber and take, a couple of tablespoons on the first pass. You really want to try, maybe a teaspoon and work up from there. But again, it brings up the argument, or rather the discussion of, adding in a good probiotic supplement as well. And, there are plenty of good probiotics on the market these days.
You talked a little bit about percentages and ratios with like 70% vegetables. Would it be, can you give us kind of an ideal kind of macronutrient breakdown for a ketogenic approach you're recommending?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you're really trying to push ketosis, and I think beyond what we are talking about here, when we're trying to push ketosis for a child, for example, with intractable epilepsy, these kids are on 80% calories or so derived from fat. So it's a very, very focused approach in a situation where, you know, a child or even an adult. There's a wonderful video of a woman on my website who wanted to get the word out about that. We're pushing very high levels of fat with specific fats added, like the coconut or MCT oils, and being really restrictive in terms of protein and carbohydrates. You know, she's down to probably 30 grams, 40 grams of carbs a day, and a similar amount, probably around about 40 grams of protein. So it's aggressive, but man, is it handy in terms of getting seizures under control. Because, you know, these days, if you have epilepsy and you fail one medication, well, step 2 is you add another drug to that. And after 2 drugs aren't working, the current recommendation in neurology is that you have to have a part of your brain whacked out by a surgeon, because that's step 3. And, you know, here is a dietary modality that can be used with a medication that can actually be effective at times without medication. That's been proven hugely effective since 1921. So I wrote a blog about that saying, hey, look, before we're whacking out people's temporal lobes, which will never grow back, why don't we at least try them on a ketogenic diet? So I think that for our purposes, you know, 60, 70% calories derived from fat is reasonable. And I think that, you know, the more protein after that and less carbohydrates will do it. But again, everybody's physiology is different, and everybody's ability to get into that low-grade ketosis is going to be different based upon, you know, their specifics of their genetics, but also specifics of how and what they're eating. You know, you talked about, for example, potato starch. What we know about potato starch is that this is effective in regulating GLP-1, which is a hormone that plays a really important role in regulating blood sugar as well as insulin sensitivity. So there's, you know, so many nuances out there. But again, I'm really big on other forms of prebiotics, being like acacia gum and baobab, but recognize that eating those prebiotic-rich fiber foods, again, you know, the Jerusalem artichoke, jicama, one of my favorites. These are foods that really can bump up your body's ability to regulate its sugar and to help your body move into ketosis, which is really what you want.
Doc, just take a step back. We started a charity a couple years ago called Wade's Army, and it was started in memory of a little boy named Wade DeBrune who passed away from neuroblastoma. He was the son of my wife's best friend growing up, and she had twins, and Wade ended up, contracting neuroblastoma. He fought it off, and then it came back, and he passed away before the age of 2. And it was significant to us because not only is it my wife's best friend, but also I have twin girls. And about the time coming up on a year of his passing, my wife asked if there was anything we can do, and so we, in typical fashion, said, you know what, let's do a T-shirt drive, see if we can raise some money. And that first year we raised, I think, $18,000, and then the next year we raised 50, and then this year we raised 100. And the big thing that I wanted to do was not only be able to offer money and help these families because it was so underrepresented in terms of cancer, and these little guys are, there's only a few places that really deal with these, with neuroblastoma. And so the other big key was actually funding research. So a year ago we funded a research study, and this year when I said, you know what, if I want to fund a research study, I want it to be something about ketogenic diets being used with cancer patients. Having, Fred Hatfield, who is another friend of ours who, starved off his cancer with ketogenic, and talking to Dom D'Agostino and other people, when we approached the FDA about actually funding our own study and doing some form of trials with ketogenic diets, we were met honestly with, we will not do any type of study that has to do with dietary or with diet and cancer. And so we've been reaching out and looking for people that will help us, or that we can work to fund actually a study for neuroblastoma or cancer, that we can start using this as a treatment, because most of these kids end up passing because the treatments and the chemotherapy is so toxic to the body, and these little kids, 18 months old, 12 months old, just aren't strong enough to be able to fight this stuff off, and then when it comes back, it takes them.
Well, it's honorable and beautiful that you've dedicated to doing that, and B, you're actually on target in terms of the mission here, because there's huge precedent for that. I'm sure you're aware, and I would tell your listeners, if you go to the Huffington Post and just put in Huffington, Perlmutter, and brain cancer, you'll see that I've written extensively on the role of diet in brain cancer. In fact, one of the articles I wrote is called "When It Comes to Brain Cancer, Let's Look Beyond Chemo," because we understand that uniquely brain tumors and cancer in general requires sugar to metabolize, and that the brain is really wonderfully adaptable to burning fat as opposed to sugar. So you can basically starve out a tumor to some degree. There's a wonderful researcher named Dr. Thomas Seyfried, and Dr. Seyfried is at Boston College, wrote a really incredible book about the treatment of a very aggressive type of brain tumor, the most common brain tumor in humans, called glioblastoma, which is what killed Senator Ted Kennedy, and revealing his incredibly effective approach of putting these people in ketosis and how the tumors regress. And so what you're talking about is really being vigorously explored now in medicine, and unfortunately, because it is nutritional and dietary, it can't be patented, and because it's not patented, you don't have a huge pharmaceutical consortium lining up behind it. It's basically putting people on a ketogenic diet. And hey, likely people with brain tumors are going to have seizures anyway. So, you can take care of two problems with one approach, and that is going on a ketogenic diet. So, again, if your listeners want more information on that, go to the Huffington Post and just, I guess you wouldn't Google me there, but you would whatever you do on Huffington Post, you'd Huffington me and put in Perlmutter and brain cancer and the word Huffington, and you'll see what I've written about that.
The other big thing that's really, I'm surprised that we don't have more information on, and it's pretty sad that we're in a state today with autism where it's basically people just kind of shrug their shoulders, and you got one camp talking about, children being inundated with vaccinations. You have another stuff with antibiotics and, deteriorating gut biota, and then you have a whole bunch of people that just kind of shrug their shoulders and have no idea, and just like, there's nothing we can do. It's genetic. It's this. I mean, it seems like I've never in my life seen anything where you have one issue and so many people are pointing so many different fingers in so many different directions.
And I would agree with you. And I couldn't begin to tell you the number of patients over the years that I have seen who came to me saying, I went to the XYZ clinic and then the ABC clinic, and they told me that there was really nothing that could be done. And, we would then say, here's a list of 15 things that we'll start doing today, and make no promises that any of this is going to turn your situation around, whether it's dementia or who knows what. But at least here's what we're going to do, because here's some science behind it. For example, using a ketogenic diet in patients with ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease, for which there is no treatment today. None whatsoever. Why in the world would I be recommending that ALS patients go on a ketogenic diet? I've done so because when you look at least the laboratory model of ALS, the laboratory rodent that is able to get Lou Gehrig's disease, the lifespan of these laboratory animals was doubled when they put them on a ketogenic diet, because the brain, the central nervous system, including the spinal cord, thrives in a ketone-rich environment. And I say to my patients, look, it hasn't been proven yet in humans in ALS, but it's had a dramatic effect in a human study on another degenerative condition called Parkinson's. Incredible. Small study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, in the Archives of Neurology, which is put out by the AMA, that showed huge improvement in Parkinson's patients going on a ketogenic diet. And again, I will look eye to eye to an ALS patient saying, they're asking. They say, Doc, what do you got? What do you even think might work? And I tell them, I don't know, but here's what I think we should do, based upon where we are today in terms of the science, along with other things. And these are people who've been given a death sentence. These are people like the child with the neuroblastoma that you were involved with. These are people like those who have glioblastoma, an aggressive malignancy of the brain in adults, that don't have anything else going for them. And you say, look, I appreciate the fact that you've put your faith in my decisions. I'm making these decisions based upon these studies. Here they are. Let's read them together, and let's get up. Let's step up to the plate. A lot of games are won even when it's fourth and long. So, it's not over till it's over. And I really, I want to stay in there with people as long as there's a chance.
It's kind of surprising a little bit that something as simple as just making some dietary changes seems to be met with so much just angst and fury and anger and slamming doors. I mean, it just doesn't seem that improbable to me. It never did. I mean, it's like, hey, I've seen guys, make dietary modifications, whether it's eat less food and lose weight. I've seen people, eat more protein, lift more weights, and get bigger and stronger. I've seen people make body composition changes. I've seen performance changes, and it all really centers around, sleep, food, and consistent activity. It kind of basically baffles me a little bit that people would be so willing to, argue it. I mean, up the street from where I live, there's one of the oncologists is one of the top guys in Orange County, and he just lost his mother-in-law to cancer. And actually talking with him about weight and neuroblastoma, when I mentioned a ketogenic diet, he had no input and no thought on it. He's like, it was never taught to us, in medical school and all the stuff
I would agree with that. I would agree that it wasn't taught to him in medical school or her. But that said, when was that? How many years ago was that? Let's stay on top of the literature. This is being explored and talked about in mainstream journals these days. And in terms of the response to the naysayers, I like to quote Maurice Maeterlinck, who was a Belgian poet, Nobel Prize winner, and he said, "At every crossway on the road that leads to the future, each progressive spirit is opposed by 1,000 men appointed to defend the past." So I actually ended my last book, Brainmaker, with that quote. It was on the glass door of the office of my good friend Amar Bose, who built a company with these sound reducing headphones and audio. And because he pushed the envelope in his notion of audio and the physics of audio, and built all this incredible equipment. And I love that quote because everybody wants to defend the status quo, how it's been. Well, we've never done it that way. I love it when that's the response. Even with publishing books, my publisher would say things like, well, normally a book like this dealing with health will come out in January. And I would say things like, that's exactly why I don't want to do it. It's because it's always done that way. We've got to break the mold. People are interested in health 365 days a year. So I think really good to challenge these long-held beliefs that, yeah, carbohydrates, even if they're complex, may not be good for you. No, you shouldn't start your day with a 12-ounce glass of orange juice. No, really? Why? Because that's 9 teaspoons of pure sugar. That's 36 grams of carbohydrates. Orange juice, you're threatening orange juice? You must be some kind of radical. No, I'm simply telling you what's in that liquid that you're drinking that has the same amount of sugar as a can of Coke. So people have to be educated.
Anybody listening to this that actually has kids will definitely agree with Doc. I mean, I know that the difference between my children in terms of listening, behavior, and just general being around them when they consume sugar is a complete nightmare. Like I remember, we went out on Halloween and we're trying to pull away all the sugar, and we actually gave our kids a couple pieces of candy after I went through them. And watching them, not only have emotional breakdowns and this, I mean, seeing how powerful that stuff is, I'm like, dude, we don't give our kids that stuff for the mere fact that, one, they don't listen, and two, they're just not emotionally able to deal with that, and it's kind of crippling. I know it sounds terrible to deny your kids Halloween candy, but you know what?
You can load your kids up with sugar. That's totally fine, but just make sure that you've got the Ritalin handy. because they're going to need something.
But I mean, that's really what we've become, and I don't even know why we call, in medicine, it's become modern pharmacology. It's like, instead of making a dietary change, and we run into this all the time. People would much rather make take a pill, whether it be like, hey, my kid has behavioral problems, I'm probably pumping him full of crap and sugar, so let's give him a Ritalin pill, which is going to make him a zombie. Or, you know what, hey, instead of getting up and doing 20 minutes of aerobic exercise and maybe making some diet modifications and some lifestyle changes, just give me a pill so I don't have to deal with it. And it's become this, this opportunity. And you know what? For the most part, that's what become, I don't even know why they call it medicine anymore. It seems like just like, the same thing from a vending machine. Just enter your problem and it'll spit you out a pill, which is basically the equivalent of going to the doctor these days.
Yeah, reflexive medicine. I did an interview yesterday with Fox News, or maybe day before yesterday, and it was on this idea of, can we improve a kid's performance shy of giving them drugs with ADHD by changing their diet? And I'm grateful that the reporter came and wanted to do the story, but why would you not at least give it some consideration prior to putting your child on an amphetamine? The long-term risk for the developing brain have never been studied with respect to that drug. So, when you say it like that, people say, oh, yeah, I guess that does make sense. But by and large, 2/3 of the 6.5 million American children who've been labeled with this diagnosis are on medication. So if you're in the biz of selling these drugs, you're as happy as a clam at high tide. But we don't know what that's doing to the developing brain. And it's basically these are mostly amphetamine based. We don't know what that does to the brain. It's a scary proposition.
Doc, my first experience at all with Adderall or Ritalin or any of that was, I think it was my third or fourth year in the NFL. I took a helmet to the shin and broke my leg, and they ended up casting me for about 5 days, and I played about 3.5 weeks later. And I remember, I had a lot of pain because, you break your fibula clean in half, but it's only a 12% weight-bearing bone, so technically you don't need that bone to play football. And so as I go out to play, I was having pain, and so the doctors were offering me painkillers. And I remember I felt kind of looped out. I was like, man, I feel real tired. I feel a little bit of groggy. So I might have given you too much. And they wrote me a prescription for Adderall. And the doctor's like, here, take this and it'll balance you out. And I remember kind of laughing a little bit at the time and being like, so you guys basically gave me too many painkillers, and now you're going to try to give me an upper. I'm like, all right, this is the game we're playing in. And, that was just, kind of one of my little entrees into this thing where I realized that if you're not looking out for yourself, nobody else is. And I looked at it like, hey, if I got to take painkillers to go play this, I'm just going to go out and, for some reason I got a pretty good pain threshold where I was able to just go out and suffer through it. But, that's really, I think, what, a lot of the guys came out in the NFL and talked about that, that's the sport of, football and making money. And it's like, hey, if we got to, pump a guy full of some stuff to get him through, we're going to do that, which has just kind of been standard operating procedure for the most of everybody.
It's a great story. I'll tell you a story that's certainly far bigger implication, and that is that a large study in Finland that you can read about on WebMD in March of this year showed that the risk of developing type 2 diabetes in women who are taking the most widely prescribed drug on the planet, which are drugs to reduce cholesterol, the risk for them getting type 2 diabetes is increased 50%. So what happens then? Just like you said, they'll need a diabetes pill to control their diabetes now that they've taken the cholesterol drug. So one hand feeds the other as it relates to these drugs. It's really pretty sad. Now, I don't know if you ever heard that statistic, and probably you haven't. Well, you're pretty well read, so you probably have, but most people have never heard about that. But it was published in an extremely well-respected journal, and showing that 50% increased risk of diabetes in women taking statin drugs. There are 29 million Americans right now with diabetes, and it doubles your risk for Alzheimer's. Taking the statin drug increases your risk for diabetes by 50%, and therefore 50% of women who take a statin drug will double their risk for Alzheimer's, for which there is no treatment. Oh, it's really quite something.
Well, I guess we solved the world's problems.
Well, we did
it in just over an hour. I feel good about this.
Yeah, just chuck DHA.
We do light the candles, and but what I think we do have to curse the darkness a little bit as well. I think we got to point out what's really messed up around and let people hear things like this, the study on cholesterol-lowering drugs, for example. You got to know that stuff. People have to be educated consumers and not just go to the doctor and act like automatons and do exactly as they're told and being the, quote, good patient. You want to question things. And Lord knows, with the availability of information on the internet that we have today, you don't buy anything that you don't look at what people, what are the comments, what was the Amazon rating. Everybody's looking at that. You've got to do the same thing with healthcare. You've got to be a discerning consumer.
Well, I mean, I think we run into this thing, and please don't take any offense to this as a doctor, but most of the doctors that we run into, there's a bit of arrogance that, hey, I've gone to med school, I'm the expert, you're the layman, you don't understand, to the point where, I mean, even my mom actually went to the doctor for an injured knee, and the doctor wanted to do a pretty extensive surgery, and I had used Bionic Care, which was a machine where it drives low-level current and can basically regenerate a knee. And I used it with great results for my own knee. And I told my mom, I'm like, dude, don't do that. Use the Bionic Care. And so she goes in and asks the doctor for a prescription for Bionic Care, which at point he tells her, well, if you're not going to listen to me and you know more than me, then why are you here? And fires her as a patient. So we go get her another doctor, and she ends up getting the Bionic Care and going to it, and now her knee is fine. So I think we get into this situation where, we've, not only the arrogance, but, there's bills to pay. I got a big practice, and it just seems easier just to kind of offer some opportunities like that. So I don't know. I think the bigger problem lies in standardized healthcare and really the model that's been set up in this country, that it's not necessarily profitable to heal people and to get them better, or more importantly, put preventative medicine out there as much as it is to just treat the symptoms and hope for and hope that all of a sudden more and more stuff happens, so I can keep making more and more money on the pharmaceuticals.
I would agree. You look at things like Obamacare and the healthcare initiative, et cetera. They call these things healthcare plans, and they have nothing to do with health. You don't use your insurance when you're healthy. You just want to have something in case I get sick, because Lord knows the bills are going to be so high, and I don't want to have that happen. I don't want to be a burden on society. So luckily I have insurance. But if you keep people healthy in the first place, then you're not going to have those expenses related to illness. So I sure agree with you that the Nei Jing, the Yellow Emperor, 4th century BC, stated that prevention is the ultimate principle of wisdom. To cure a disease after it is manifest is like digging a well when one feels thirsty, or forging weapons when the war has already begun. So again, we are forging these weapons for these issues. We're building these wonderful new products and waging the war on cancer and the war on this and that. Whereas we should nourish and keep people healthy, and not going to be preemptive here. John Kennedy in his inaugural address said that the time to fix the roof is when the sun is shining. That was the statement. But obviously, you don't want to be fixing the roof once it's already started to rain.
Doc, with these changes to dietary recommendations through the USDA coming out and saying, hey, we need to offer more fat, or you have different things talking about that dietary cholesterol is no longer related to cholesterol within the body. What does that do to the statin market? I mean, I've kind of always been a little bit confused that they're offering statins to try to lower people's cholesterol and make some modifications and do this and this. But now that we know that that cholesterol is not really it's kind of a red herring in a lot of ways for what we've been taught, how does that affect us? Or more importantly, how does that affect probably the most prescribed drug on the market?
I think that those drugs are they're alive and well. I mean, you can buy statin drugs around the world even now without a prescription. So, by and large, the public is still under this misguided impression that cholesterol is a bad thing, that cholesterol will clog your arteries and cause terrible things to happen. And nothing is further from the truth. Cholesterol is a brain antioxidant. It's the substance that your body needs, is desperate for, to make testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, cortisol, and even vitamin D. So we've always lived wonderfully with cholesterol. and suddenly we've declared war on this. The science that underlies the link of cholesterol to heart disease basically doesn't even exist. It's not cholesterol that's the issue. It's the oxidized, damaged form of LDL, and that happens when blood sugar is elevated. So lowering cholesterol, 50% of people who have a heart attack have a normal cholesterol, thank you very much. And yet, it's looked upon, it's so vilified with this notion that cholesterol clogs the arteries. When you look under the microscope at an artery in somebody who's had a heart attack, and you look at their coronary artery, the part that they take out, what do you find? You find a bunch of inflammatory white blood cells, and you find cholesterol. You find more cholesterol, in fact, than you would find in a non-involved place. And the reason that's happening is cholesterol is brought to the area to calm the inflammation. It's like blaming the firemen for the fire because they're on the scene. So it's such a ridiculous notion. When you look, the lowest cholesterols are associated with the highest risk of dementia, of depression, of schizophrenia, of suicide, and brain hemorrhage. So we need to talk about that.
And impotence, Doc. The lowest, erectile dysfunction is directly related. So, I know that it was the highest rate of suicide in the world were southern India, with also the highest rate of vegetarians. And I remember I made that claim a couple of years ago, and people tried to come out of the woodwork at me, and I'm like, hey, we know that low blood serum cholesterol levels are directly related to a bunch of stuff you don't want, everything from not being able to hoist your sail to a host of other mental issues. So it just
I like that.
But the other one, you talk about just a basic conversion, the building block of being able to, have testosterone. So, in an environment that we're in, where we're looking to strength train performance and increase muscle mass and really ramp up, I tell people the last thing you want is to have low blood serum cholesterol. If that's the case, then you need to go check out somebody else.
Yeah, I read a report not long ago that said, now that the science has become evident, we may be actually at a place where we're going to be looking at cholesterol-raising drugs in the future. Can you imagine?
If that comes out, then I'll know that the world is at 10, that they're like, ooh, we messed that one up, now we got to raise everybody's.
Well, it's just a question of embracing a different paradigm. Like in my lectures, I often start off by saying, I really want to look at things in a different way. I said, probably everybody in the audience would agree with the statement that you wake up in the morning and the sun rises in the east. At the middle of the day, the sun has moved to the top of the sky, and then at the end of the day, the sun sets in the west. And I say, matter of fact, it's not true. The sun isn't moving. The earth is spinning. So they finally get that. Oh, I'm looking at this in a different way, and that seems to make sense. That's all I'm asking is just consider the possibility that what you're being told may not be accurate. And the gold standard remains peer-reviewed science. So that when I say, for example, that statin drugs increase the risk of diabetes in men, I will tell you that is a study published in Diabetologia in May of this year, and it's a study that involved 8,749 non-diabetic men who took statin drugs for an average of 6 years. And that study is there. You can Google it and read it. That's what the science is telling us. A very long and robust study that no one's talking about. Think about it.
No, it's no, Doc. Hey, I think we definitely hit it out of the park and really, covered everything I was excited about. Is there anything that you want to, put out? Like, where can people find you? And more importantly, do you have any new books or anything that we have to put on our, must-read list?
Oh, there are a lot of good books out right now, that's for sure. People can follow me on Facebook at David Perlmutter, MD. And I've been doing actually a lot of live interviews on Facebook. I did one last night with Dr. Christine Northrup. So I'm available there. My website is drperlmutter.com, drperlmutter.com. I blog almost every day. And, a lot of these studies that I talk about, they're listed in the science section of my website. So there's a really robust level of information there. My two newest books are both Grain Brain that we talked about, and then Brain Maker that deals with gut bacteria. But hey, that was a great interview and great conversation. I sure enjoyed it.
Doc, and if we ever can get an opportunity to get in front of the NFL, or at least get in front of the NFLPA, I'd love to link up on you on that and be able to try to offer some stuff out to some guys. I mean, I talked to Rob pretty extensively offline about being able to put together some protocols to, help people, and more importantly, help a lot of these ex-players, because I think there's just so much information and there's so much, to put it bluntly, just bullshit out there that isn't working, that I just think that we need to be a beacon of light, more importantly, for better opportunity.
Well, I'm there, and that's what it's all about. The word doctor in Latin doesn't mean healer; it means teacher. And in that regard, you're doing a lot of doctor work here by teaching people this really wonderful information, and I praise you for it.
Thank you, Doc. Yes, the feeling's very mutual.
Great. Well, all the best, and we'll talk soon.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thanks, Doc.
Okay, bye, everyone.
Thanks a lot, Doc.
Now it's time for you to empower your performance. All right, people, let's break a mental sweat. As much as we love to work on that bikini body, I hope everyone is feeling as inspired as I am to eat my way towards a sexier lady brain. Follow Dr. Perlmutter on Facebook under his name, or head directly to his website, www.drperlmutter.com, to see his blog and purchase any of his publications, including his very own cookbook. And if you need a little fun thing to get you through the next 5 minutes, try to say Perlmutter 5 times fast. I dare you. It's impossible. Until next time, bye!